Hello, good morning. This is Sky News Breakfast, live from Medikar, the main border crossing between Poland and Ukraine, and the route out of the country for Ukrainians escaping the conflict. We'll bring you all the latest throughout the morning as Russia's invasion of Ukraine takes another worrying turn. Europe's biggest nuclear power plant is shelled as Russian targets Ukraine's energy infrastructure, prompting a chilling warning from Ukraine's president.
If there is an explosion, that's the end for everyone. The end for Europe, the evacuation of Europe.
Boris Johnson says that Russia's attack on a nuclear power station could threaten the safety of all of Europe. As Russia steps up the assault on Ukraine cities, Western ministers will hold crisis talks today. The Home Secretary prepares to meet Ukrainian refugees on the Polish border as the government faces pressure to do more to help those escaping. And that's as the stream of refugees fleeing the fighting shows no sign of abating, with more than 1 million people leaving Ukraine.
I'm live in Lviv in western Ukraine as thousands upon thousands of people continue to arrive here trying to escape the Russian attack on the east of this country.
The US joins Britain in sanctioning Russian oligarchs, and more companies shun Russia, piling more financial pain on Moscow. Hello, good morning from Medikar. We're on the border between Poland and Ukraine, where many of the more than 1 million people fleeing the fighting have been arriving over the last few days. This morning, there's been another disturbing development in the conflict, with Russia targeting a crucial energy-producing city as it steps up its assault on Ukraine. A fire apparently broke out in an unused reactor at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest in Europe, after it was shelled by Russian forces. Well, in the last hour, the Ukrainian authorities have said that the fire has been extinguished and Russian forces have taken control of the site. Ukraine has warned of a nuclear disaster if it blows up, with Boris Johnson saying it could directly threaten the safety of all of Europe. Well, let's bring you the latest developments. The International Atomic Energy Agency says there's been no change to radiation levels after a fire at Europe's biggest nuclear plant. President Zelensky has warned European leaders not to allow the death of Europe from a nuclear catastrophe, while the Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he'll seek an emergency UN Security Council meeting. And this morning, foreign ministers from NATO are due to meet to discuss the crisis. Greg Milan has this report.
As if this crisis weren't dire enough, these images hold the prospect of a whole new horror in Ukraine. The shelling of the largest nuclear power plant of its kind in Europe, causing a fire. No one here needs any reminder of the potential for nuclear catastrophe. And Ukraine's president said this took the war into dangerous new territory.
If there is an explosion, that's the end for everyone. The end for Europe, the evacuation of Europe. Only urgent action by Europe can stop the Russian troops. Do not allow the death of Europe from a catastrophe at a nuclear power station.
The attack on Ukraine's infrastructure is just one of multiple fronts in an invasion that Vladimir Putin says is going to plan. This is what that looks like. Apartment buildings in the town of Borodyanka, 50 kilometers from the capital Kiev, still smouldering. The road littered with the debris of an assault that Russia says is not targeting civilians. But it is in the major cities that the fighting has intensified. Russia's defense ministry released these pictures, along with claims to have destroyed hundreds of military targets. Ukraine says that troops from Belarus have now been given the go-ahead to join the Russian invasion. Lined up against them is condemnation from around the globe. The US Secretary of State embarking on another European tour to show Russia the West remains united. In Washington, the president tightened the sanction pressure on Moscow.
Today I'm announcing that we're adding dozens of names to the list, including one of Russia's wealthiest billionaires, and I'm banning travel to America by more than 50 Russian oligarchs, their families, and their close associates.
It's ordinary Russians feeling that pressure so far. IKEA, the latest foreign company to close its doors. As all over Europe, countries are throwing open theirs. More than 1 million refugees have left in the first week, crossing the border to safety but uncertainty. A massive humanitarian operation spreading across Eastern Europe, one that will need to cope with much, much more in the weeks to come. When you consider what they've left behind, how must this show of humanity feel? Such a welcome for people who have no idea when, if ever, they'll go back to those they've left behind. Greg Milam, Sky News.
Well, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has warned that the whole of Europe is at threat by what has happened, the shelling of this nuclear plant. The Prime Minister said, I've just spoken with Zelensky, that is, of course, the President of Ukraine, about the gravely concerning situation at the Zaporozhye nuclear plant station. Russia must immediately cease its attack on the power station and allow unfettered access for emergency services to the plant. Well, as we've heard, Russian forces have attacked this plant in southeast Ukraine. It is part of an increasingly violent campaign which has ramped up in the last 48 hours. Overnight, a fire broke out at a training building outside the Zaporozhye nuclear power station in southeastern Ukraine, near the city of Enerhoda. It's Europe's largest nuclear plant and among the top 10 biggest in the world, responsible for 20% of all of Ukraine's electricity. It has now reportedly been seized by Russian forces. Moscow has launched hundreds of missiles and artillery attacks on cities and other sites around the country, making significant gains in the south. This week, Russia announced the capture of the southern city of Kherson, a vital Black Sea port of 280,000 people. And heavy fighting continues on the outskirts of the strategic port of Mariupol. The city has no water or power supply, and the mayor says Russia has cut all rail links, describing what's happening there as genocide. Well, many of those fleeing the fighting have yet to leave Ukraine and have sought refuge in the country's western city, Lviv. Our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, joins me now from there. And Adam, there must be enormous concern where you are about what has happened at this power station and what is continuing to happen in Kherson.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the indications of this war across the country is that although we're a long way from the fighting here, the ripples of that, the nervousness, the anxiety, are etched in a lot of people's faces here. Now, on the situation in the nuclear power plant, clearly lots of contradictory information coming out. The latest information that I have that I rely on is that actually there's no critical incident has been declared, that the fire has been extinguished, that some parts of that nuclear power plant are still operational, some is out, some has been shut down. But what is evident is that there is enormous natural nervousness whenever you have something as potentially catastrophically dangerous as a nuclear power plant caught between two warring armies. And I think the fact that the international inspectors are not going to be able to get to this power station. Ukraine has its own inspectorate, which at the moment is saying that the plant is safe. But, of course, in real time, how do you monitor this? We have been discussing in recent days, would Russia actually use nuclear weapons? Evidently, there is no desire among the West, among anybody sane, for nuclear weapons to be used in this conflict. Similarly, you would say anybody rational would think that when you have a nuclear power plant, your number one objective is to take care of that. I don't think we're at the point yet where anyone is going to play fast and loose with this, but it is in the middle of a war zone. So on that front, that attack on Kherson as well reverberates here, because you have people who are fleeing this country, also those who are staying here. And I have to say, the gradual erosion of people's mental health across this country is something that you see. This is a nation where people are increasingly feeling frazzled.
And how are they managing? You know, we saw so many of them yesterday arriving in Poland, and still they're coming to where you are in the hope of either maybe staying in the west of Ukraine or moving across the border into Poland and then further on. I mean you say they are frazzled, but how long can people go on like this?
Well, the estimates from the United Nations are that well over 1 million people have now left, but that number could go up to 4 million. And I have to say, one thing that strikes me is the order of this process is pretty remarkable. There is no chaos. You'll see snapshots of it, of course you will. But actually, inside this station, when I've been in there and trains have been departing, it's been very well managed. You have a lot of military personnel in there, a lot of police. And when we came this morning, this is new. Up till yesterday, it was a free-for-all, to be blunt, to get into the station. Now, there is this long snaking queue that's coming out of the station and going all the way down this line here. As we have seen all over Ukraine, the people fleeing are, in every case, women and children and pensioners, although it's predominantly women and children. A lot of the older Ukrainians, I think, either want to stay put, they'd have no desire to dislocate themselves, or there are older men who want to stay and try and sign up. Ukraine has an army of 200,000 people. By some estimates, it has a reservist force of 900,000, and these are people mobilizing in force. It's quite feasible that at some point Ukraine will have over 1 million people in active service, and this queue goes on and on and on. These are people trying to get out of here. These, I suspect, are all people who are trying to come in your direction, Jane. They're trying to get out of the country because there is a line that goes from Lviv to Poland. Now, one of the logistic challenges they face, I've been on that train, is that it's only one line. It's a line in and a line out. So if a train gets delayed going out, it gums everything coming back again. It's not an express service by any way. Not all of these people are going to get on one train, but they will be running that train constantly in and out all day long. Amidst all the grim, let's show you something here. Ukrainians love their pets. They absolutely love their animals. And you see again and again pets, some of them very friendly, some of them less so, and they're carrying their dogs and their cats with them out of this country. I spoke to someone yesterday who didn't have very much, but they did have their cat in a box, and I said, "You haven't got many possessions." They said, "I've got the most important one right here." But this kind of sea of humanity continues on, and I think when I first came here, there was almost a sense, I won't use adventure, it's not adventure, it's a horrible, horrendous situation. But there were people who still had energy, still had a kind of vibrancy and a desire to get going. I think we are now at a stage where these people are invariably exhausted. I met a woman called Jeanne yesterday who is in a shelter in the middle of the town, a theatre that's been converted into a refugee centre. She spent 6 days sleeping in a metro station in Kharkiv and has fled now here. I'm not sure I've ever seen anyone who is quite so exhausted in my life, and that is a picture that is facing across Ukraine. It's a nation that is wiped out and frantic and desperately needs help.
Yeah. Absolutely, Adam, and it's something we've seen on the faces of those arriving here in Poland as well. Thanks so much for that update from inside Ukraine. Well, in the last few moments, we've had an update from the Ministry of Defence. They've given us some information in the form of a daily briefing, and they are saying that the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, they too have found that radiation coming from their sources is within normal limits. They are also saying that Mariupol on the south coast does remain under Ukrainian control, but they think it is likely to have been encircled by Russian forces, and that the city's civilian infrastructure has been subjected, in their words, to intense Russian strikes. Well, let's talk now to Dominic Waghorn, our international affairs editor. He's in Moscow for us. And Dominic, we saw President Putin talking to the nation again yesterday. What is the feeling about his state of mind and where this could go next?
Well, it was described, Jane, by one Western official yesterday as he is rational, but only within his own sort of frame of reference. And that frame of reference is, I think, a narrower and narrower frame or space. And it's kind of informed by the generals and the intelligence people around him, who are all telling him still, I think, and have been telling him for a while, the West is out to get him and wants to topple his regime. So I think the hopes that the West has been harbouring, that the sanctions, that the pressure would make him think again, certainly were dashed by what we heard from him on that televised address last night, but also in his phone call with Emmanuel Macron, the French president, whose official said there was nothing reassuring to come out of that phone call. I think we get a very clear picture of his mind, of his intentions from both of those events, the phone call and the address. And I think the most disturbing thing about the address and from the phone call is that he clearly seems to believe his own propaganda. It's a pretty flimsy pretext on which he's going to war, a war that could destroy one country and probably destroy his own economy or do a huge amount of damage to it. But it is a pretext he seems to be believing in. And he believes that he's fighting a neo-Nazi regime, even though its president is Jewish. He believes that Ukraine is a military threat to Russia, even though Russia has overwhelming advantage militarily. He also believes the Ukrainians and the Russians, he repeated this last night, are one people. And he said that the Ukrainians have been brainwashed as if he, one man, knows better than effectively the entire nation that has decided to move further westward. So despite all that sort of, I mean, you could call it lies, you could call it fantasy or deluded, which was what Macron told Putin last night, it is something he seems to believe in. He's doubling down, he's pressing on regardless, and the cost is going to be enormous for Ukraine and for his own country. And we're looking, I think, at a protracted, grinding war, the West piling on Ukraine's side, supplying weapons, Russia pushing in with all its military might, with no real end in sight.
And Dominic, as we talk to you, we're seeing Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, arriving in Brussels. More diplomacy today. She's meeting Jens Stoltenberg and Antony Blinken there to see if they can find any way forward in this conflict. But we also heard yesterday that there have been a lot more clampdowns again on free speech on the media in Moscow. We saw the story about some children being arrested for laying flowers at the Ukrainian embassy, or trying to. What is the state of mind, as far as you're able to glean it, of the Russian people about what's happening?
I think it's deepening concern, but it depends on who you speak to. I think a lot of Russians get their news from the official state media, and they're being told still this is a limited military operation. It's necessary to deal with the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and a lot of them believe that. And I think if you're out of the cities, you're less concerned about sanctions. You probably grow your own vegetables. You're probably poor anyway, and you do believe your government is doing the right thing. I think if you're metropolitan, if you live in cities, if you're better educated, you're really concerned. I think ordinary people are getting a sense, though, that this is economically going to affect them. Things like already short supplies in pharmacies, people obviously not being able to get Apple iPhones or be able to pay on Apple Pay. I think it's a gradual process, and obviously the ruble crashing is obviously of concern as well. It's going to take a while for the penny to drop, but I think Russians are concerned about that. But they are believing, a lot of them, still the propaganda they're being told by Vladimir Putin. And the key question really is he being affected by this? Is he worried? It doesn't seem to be the case, because I think if you look at strongmen recently, look at Maduro in Venezuela, look at the Ayatollahs in Iran, actually sanctions do help them. I mean, if you talk to Western diplomats, they'll tell you there's a pretty narrow range of options. None of them are very good, but something has to be done, and sanctions are the best option. But there is a huge danger that they're going to affect Russian people a lot more than that kind of narrow securocrat elite surrounding Putin. And the president himself, he can dig in, and if he does become more oppressive, which seems, as you're saying, much more likely, we might well see a state of emergency declared or other emergency laws. He's going to be able to put the country on a war footing, declare any criticism and dissent treasonous, and that's going to, I think, entrench him in power and allow him more space and freedom to carry on with this war.
OK, Dominic, thanks so much for that update from Moscow. Well, let's just remind you of some of the numbers. Over 1 million people have fled to neighbouring countries so far, and that number is rising by the hour. Some 90,000 have already travelled into Western Europe, but the largest number have crossed the border into Poland, around 500,000 people. Nearly 140,000 have gone to Hungary, which has changed its hardline policy on accepting refugees. Neighbouring Moldova has received now nearly 100,000 people, and over 79,000 have crossed into Slovakia, while the Romanian authorities say more than 150,000 people have arrived from Ukraine. Well, let's turn back to the UK now, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, joins me now live from Westminster. Good to talk to you this morning, sir. Let's just start straight away with the Zaporozhye nuclear plant and the attack on it. We have heard just now from the Ministry of Defence that radiation levels are normal, but how concerned are you about the fact that this plant was hit? Do you think it was targeted, or was this just part of warfare?
Well, at the very least, it was clearly a reckless bombardment of a very sensitive and precarious and dangerous facility. And the fact that the Russians kept bombarding it after there was the fire and the Ukrainian emergency rescue team were trying to get to that makes it doubly reprehensible. The Prime Minister's been very clear on this. He's called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council in New York in order to ramp up the pressure on these appalling tactics that we're seeing from the Kremlin, but also to make sure we're supporting the Ukrainian government in any way we can.
Does this perhaps suggest to you that President Putin is serious about nuclear war?
I think the way I would read it is that the early part of his military campaign has stuttered and stumbled. It's not been as effective. I think there's been a lot of pushback amongst the Russians that this isn't what they had expected. This isn't what he'd sold. He'd said it would be a cakewalk into Ukraine. That clearly hasn't happened. And he's responding with ever more heavy-handed and brutal tactics. And that is also, I think, a reflection of the fact that the international community has been more resolute than perhaps he'd expected with the concerted package of sanctions, which has had a very initially very powerful impact on, for example, the Russian ruble, the Russian stock market. They've had to double interest rates. So we will continue to starve the finances that fund Putin's war machine and support the Ukrainians in their courageous defence against this illegal invasion.
But whilst it may well be impacting on some Russians, it doesn't seem to be changing President Putin's mind any, does it?
Well, it won't happen overnight. We need to keep up the pressure, which is why we're taking the actions that we're taking. But it has had an immediate impact. And of course, and we need to show the strategic stamina to see this through in Ukraine. And of course, it is dawning on many, whether it's the conscripts who are out there in Ukraine, told that they were a peacekeeping force, facing fearsome resistance, receiving illegal orders to attack civilian targets, which could end up seeing them in the dock of a court or even in prison for war crimes. And of course, those who are bankrolling Putin are being hit where it hurts as well. But you're right to say it's not going to happen overnight. I think we need to get set for a much longer, protracted crisis in Ukraine, and we'll need to have the stamina with our international partners for that.
Are you concerned about President Putin's state of mind?
Look, I think it's clearly irrational, and even if I looked at it through the narrowest Russian perspective, clearly counterproductive to Russian interests. And you can see that in the economic consequences, and I believe you'll see that in the casualties that they're taking and will continue to take. I've got no idea, I'm not a psychiatrist, but it is clearly irrational and counterproductive for Russians, let alone the impact, the horrific impact it's having on the people of Ukraine and the wider nervousness we've all got now around regional security.
How concerned are you about President Zelensky in Ukraine, and what help can the UK give to him? Because he has become such a galvanising figure, quite an inspirational figure inside Ukraine. We know that he has been targeted by Russian forces. If he were to be attacked, or if he was forced to leave, what impact do you think that would have on the conflict?
Well, we know that the Russian playbook has involved targeted assassinations. We've seen that in the streets of Salisbury in 2018. So I think we do need to support President Zelensky in every way we can. Of course, we give him advice, and we'll be careful about divulging too much of that. But we also give him military hardware. We've given his troops training under Operation Orbital, and there's a massive package of economic and humanitarian support for him as well. So we won't go into too much of some of the finer details of it, but we are willing to do whatever it takes to support the Ukrainian defence and indeed the president in what is a very courageous stance that he's taking.
What does that mean?
I just explained to you what it involves.
You won't give us any more details on exactly what the UK is sending to help Ukrainians on this front?
We've provided anti-tank hardware. We're continuing and willing to provide other military hardware to allow Ukrainians to defend themselves. We provided humanitarian assistance on top of the economic assistance to deal with, obviously, the energy pressures that they will face. And we will look across the board at what else we can do. We're going to support the International Criminal Court. The chief prosecutor, I believe, is going to Ukraine. If we can support that accountability, and it's critical that evidence of war crimes is preserved so that those responsible right across the chain of command can be held accountable. So from war crimes through to humanitarian assistance, through to the hardware to defend the streets and the cities of Ukraine, we will provide whatever we can. And of course, the most important thing is to work with our allies to make it as effective as possible.
You mentioned sanctions. Let's go back to them. France and Germany have already started seizing oligarchs' yachts. Shouldn't we be seizing property, as Tom Tugendhat has suggested?
Well, we have got sanctions on over 100 entities. You've seen 2 individuals, Usmanov and Shuvalov, overnight. But what we're doing is making sure we take the most effective measures. We need evidence to seize property. And just to give you one illustration, because it's been put about that we're slow or we're lagging behind, actually, we've sanctioned more Russian banks than the EU, including the biggest Russian bank, Sberbank. We've prevented millions of Russian companies from being listed in the UK or raising loans in the UK. And we will look carefully at how we can expedite and strengthen all the powers that we've got. So just to give you 2 examples, on Monday we're going to be putting through at pace the Economic Crimes Bill, which will strengthen the unexplained wealth orders and create greater transparency around who owns foreign-owned companies, who is the ultimate owner, in order for us to take faster and more effective measures. But we've got one of the most robust and rigorous sanctions regimes in the world. We do need to have a legal basis and evidence to take those measures, otherwise you end up tripping up, and that just gives a propaganda coup to whoever we want to target. And of course, I would also just say, we're not targeting all international finance coming into the UK. We want to be open to that. We're not targeting blanket Russian money. We are targeting the corrupt, the kleptocrats, and those linked to Putin and his war machine. And it's very important that we are targeted in what we do, because that's the most effective way to increase the squeeze on Vladimir Putin and his war machine.
Back in 2010, the Conservative government changed the visa system to encourage more high net worth individuals to come into the UK. In hindsight, do you think that that was possibly an error, that possibly has led to a blind eye being turned to some Russian money that perhaps shouldn't have done coming into the UK?
Well, the Home Secretary has already dealt with the Tier 1 visas, and it's true to say that we want to be open to business and open to international investment. It's part of our USP in global Britain, but at the same time, we have led the way in taking targeted sanctions. Just to give you 2 further illustrations, particularly relevant to Russia, as Foreign Secretary, I introduced the Sergei Magnitsky sanction regime for human rights abuses, asset freezes and visa bans, and we extended it to corruption. So we have been at the vanguard of striking this balance between being an open economy but not allowing dirty money and those with blood on their hands to place their assets here, and we're strengthening that even further.
Okay, good to talk to you, Dominic Raab. Thanks very much for joining us today. Well, let's bring in Sky's Ali Fortescue, who joins me now from Westminster. Clearly concerned, Ali, about what is happening in Russia and in Ukraine, but from Mr. Raab, the hope really that diplomacy is still going to win through.
Yeah, that's right. He called the events at the nuclear power plant yesterday reckless. I think what was particularly interesting was hearing Dominic Raab responding to that criticism about Britain not acting quickly enough on Russian oligarchs, not acting quickly enough on sanctions. And he said that actually we have sanctioned more Russian banks than the European Union. But when it comes to individuals, we know that the European Union are well ahead of us. They have sanctioned 26 individuals, which is double the number of Russians that have been sanctioned by Britain, even though, of course, we have two more names yesterday joining the government's list, Alisher Usmanov and Igor Shuvalov, two more men, two more Russian billionaires, worth saying. One of their yachts was seized too yesterday in Germany, and now they will see their assets frozen in Britain, won't be able to come to the UK, and British people, individuals and businesses won't be able to deal with them anymore. So he pointed to those two new names joining the list, but I think there will still be pressure on the government. He pointed to the economic crime bill, which is going to be in Parliament on Monday, but that is basically about sort of making it easier to unmask who actually is behind the money, who actually owns properties, by making them join a register. But there is an 18-month grace period for that, and that is something that has been criticised by Labour, who say that that is far too much time, gives people time to wiggle out of it, and that is something that we know the government are looking at. But Dominic Raab did point to the economic crime bill. He also said that we need evidence to seize property. We need a legal basis, he said. And that, of course, is something the government have pointed to before, the fact that they need to follow due legal process. And, of course, when they're dealing with people who have deep pockets and who potentially could bring a long, convoluted, expensive legal battle, that is obviously a big challenge that the government want to avoid, but they are facing pressure. The Lib Dems saying that they should, and some Conservative backbenchers like Tom Tugendhat saying that they should seize properties rather than just freezing assets. That's something that reportedly Michael Gove might be looking at, but all of this, the criticism is taking far too long.
OK, Ali, good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Ali Fortescue there in Westminster for us. Well, as we've been hearing, more than 1 million refugees have now crossed the Ukrainian border into neighbouring countries. Germany is beginning to welcome thousands through its own border. Sky's Sadia Chowdhury reports how those in Berlin are making displaced Ukrainians feel at home.
German hospitality that matches German efficiency. And when the two come together, the result is this. A fully organised reception area here at Berlin station for the hundreds of Ukrainian refugees arriving from the Poland-Ukraine border. Like Anastasia, whose journey has already taken nearly 100 hours.
I came with my mother, and now we feel like we are homeless. We are homeless in this moment, and we should handle basic things. We have no stuff, we have no money, we have no anything now.
In scenes reminiscent of 7 years ago when Germans lined stations to welcome Syrian refugees, Berlin Central is paved with donations. Clothes, toys, hot drinks. 1 million or so refugees have already crossed from Ukraine into the European Union in eastern Poland, Slovakia and Hungary and northern Romania. In Germany, it started as a trickle of a few hundred a day. It's now grown into a steady flow of more than 1,000 people.
We have to run into the basement once or twice a day due to airstrikes. Nobody knows when it happens, so you have to have everything ready. Documents, food, and that's not a life.
The Deutsche Bahn train company has made travel free for refugees coming from Poland and around the country. A small gesture perhaps, but one that offers significant relief. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News.
Well, I'm joined now by the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, Enver Solomon. Good to talk to you today. Put it in context for us. We had the UN yesterday saying that this was the fastest movement of refugees this century. How big potentially could this be?
This could be very big. It's quite extraordinary. The numbers that the UN are talking about are around about 4 million and possibly as many as 7 million. If you just think the fact that in 8 days, that's just 8 days, 1 million people have been on the move and crossed the borders of Ukraine into neighbouring countries. In another 8 days or another 10 days or 2 weeks, we could easily have double that number and the numbers could go on rising. And these are people who are in great need, and the world needs to step up and support them. Europe and the UK need to play its part, providing them with sanctuary and supporting them at this time of a terrible human tragedy unfolding.
The UK says it is doing what it can. We just spoke to Dominic Raab a short time ago. What would you like to see the government doing more?
Well, I think it's an important first step they've made by relaxing the visa rules for people that have family members. And they've also announced what they're describing as a humanitarian sponsorship pathway. But it's not clear how that humanitarian pathway is going to work. And our concern is that actually the numbers that the UK does welcome might not be that high. What we would like to see is the government considering more flexibility. And that flexibility could be put in place by allowing any Ukrainian to quickly apply for what's known as a humanitarian visa, so they could come to the UK and they could be welcomed to stay in the UK and given permission to be here for as long as they need to be here. At the same time, I think it's absolutely critical because this conflict is likely to play out. It's likely to become protracted. That's what I think the expectation is. And if that is the case, we could see millions of refugees in neighbouring countries, sometimes very poor neighbouring countries like Moldavia, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And if that's the case, it's critical that in the longer term we work with the UN and we have a resettlement programme in the way that we did for Syrians to come to the UK.
What do you make of the Home Secretary saying that the UK's reluctance to expand it so quickly is due to, in her words, the strongest security advice? What do you think she's concerned about?
Well, I think one needs to ask government about that. I'm not privy to that information. I don't doubt that there are concerns in the same way that during the summer last year when the horrendous situation played out in Afghanistan and we had to evacuate thousands of people, there were also security concerns then, and previously there were concerns with Syria. So back in 2005. So I don't doubt that there are concerns, but I think there's ways round these concerns. You can carry out biometric tests easily by ensuring that people who then arrive in the UK are properly checked so that any measures can be taken to ensure that the UK is protected from any individuals that might pose a threat to the UK.
Are you concerned that if the UK doesn't allow more Ukrainians in, that they will join the people that we've seen, for example, trying to get across the channel on boats, trying to get across the channel in lorries and things like that? Or do you think that most Ukrainians who've left will, as you say, stay in countries closer to Ukraine?
Well, the reality is, with situations like this, and the same happened with Syria back in 2015, is that lots of people do stay in neighbouring countries because they want to try and get back to their homeland as soon as possible. But there are also many that want to move to other countries, to safe countries, to rebuild their lives. And if we don't have enough safe routes for people to get to the UK, the reality is that some will make journeys overland and some could end up coming through France, taking very dangerous journeys, and that very dangerous journey across the world's most busiest shipping lane across the channel to the UK. And it's absolutely imperative that people who want to come to the UK are given the opportunity to do so safely. And that's why our concern is that what the government has announced so far might not necessarily provide enough of a safe route for Ukrainians. It's not clear because we haven't had the full details on this humanitarian sponsorship scheme yet. But our concern is that it could result in a limited number of people being able to come because the bureaucracy of the scheme might just make it too complicated. So I think it's imperative the government is more flexible going forward and looks at very quick ways that people can apply for what is known as a humanitarian visa to come to the UK, to reach safety here, to rebuild their lives if they want to do that.
Enver Solomon from the Refugee Council, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. Well, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, and the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, are among those attending an urgent meeting of EU foreign ministers today. NATO foreign ministers are also holding emergency talks. Sky's Laura Bundock joins me now from Brussels. Laura, it feels like I'm asking you the same question every time we speak, but there is more diplomacy and there is the possibility of more sanctions. What have the diplomats got in their arsenal that they think they could try now to deploy today?
I think that's all to be discussed and debated today. This morning at NATO, foreign ministers here are gathering to discuss the situation in Ukraine and to look at what more the alliance can do to support Ukraine. It's very clear the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, believes more can be done. And we've already heard how NATO is bolstering its eastern flank. Liz Truss was in Lithuania yesterday. She met her counterparts from the Baltic states to look at the situation for them and to discuss what more NATO could do. And I think she'll be coming here to NATO with a very clear message that NATO needs to respond further. It's already engaged and is using the NATO response force. That's French troops arriving in Romania. But I think there is certainly a feeling from the UK that NATO can go further with that. And in this enormous day of diplomacy, it doesn't just end at NATO. There's a meeting of G7 leaders due to take place. And then towards the end of the day, the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union meeting, and it's inviting its US, Canadian and Ukrainian counterparts, as well as Liz Truss. She'll be the first UK minister to attend a foreign affairs meeting in Brussels since Brexit. But it'll be interesting to hear via video link the Ukrainian foreign minister, and I think he's expected to make a big plea for more support to the Ukraine's military operation, particularly when it comes to aircraft. No aircraft have been provided by the EU yet, and I think that's what we will hear from him later. But Liz Truss not mixing her words when she says they want to send strong support for the Ukraine while tightening the vice on Putin's war machine, as she put it. Jane.
Laura, thanks a lot. Well, Russian politicians will today consider proposals to punish people with up to 15 years in prison for disseminating what is deemed to be false information about the Russian armed forces. I'm joined now by a former special advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Cormac Smith. Cormac, good to talk to you. The bill that the Russian Parliament have debated, in their words, it would punish those who distort the purpose, role and tasks of Russian armed forces during special military and other operations. What does this mean and how dangerous do you think it is?
Jane, good morning and thank you for the opportunity. This bill, I believe, goes to the absolute heart of Putin's problem with Ukraine. I think we've already seen the absolute false narratives and lies of denazifying Ukraine and demilitarizing Ukraine because it is a threat to Russia. I think the world has seen those for the thin lies that they are. What Putin fears and what he has always feared is a democratic, strong, successful and free Ukraine on his doorstep, because that is a threat to his position in the Kremlin, because it is likely to encourage and to give energy to his own people who have been severely repressed, and this is one more repressive measure. Russia is a country that lies on an industrial scale. That was a phrase that my foreign minister, Pavlo Klimkin, was very, very keen to use when we worked together. And there are two points. They use lies strategically. There is what they broadcast in terms of false narratives from the Kremlin right down through the likes of RT and Sputnik and so forth. But on the other side is the absolute iron grip that they have always kept on the Russian people and keeping the truth from them. And this is the latest step. And indeed, as your Moscow correspondent, I think earlier reflected, is being seen by many in the West as a possible precursor to imposing martial law across the Russian Federation, which will give Putin even more repressive powers.
Is there anything positive we can take from it? I wonder if it perhaps means that Putin is getting the sense that he is losing the information war.
I think the positive thing that we can take from it is that this psychopathic thug is fearful. He is feeling fear, but unfortunately what we're seeing is he is doubling down at every level. It's interesting, I was told late last night by a government source, there's another draft law which is going to be pushed through the Duma with great haste, which is the fact that those drafted, because they're now starting to send reinforcements in, and those drafted, the first to be drafted will be the peace protesters. And I think this just shows you the absolute hatred and murderous spite that is at the heart of this man and the heart of his regime, and in particular the hatred and the spite that they have towards Ukraine, which unfortunately has been seen with the barbarous and genocidal attacks which he has begun to unleash on Ukraine in the last few days.
Just how limited are Russian people's access to information? I mean, we know that over the last few days, Putin has closed down a number of news organisations that were broadcasting more independently. But what about things like Google and Wikipedia?
Well, look, when I was in Ukraine between 2016 and 2018, there was a very considerable piece of research done by the Estonians and also the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, a very well-respected organization that's set up after Maidan. And this research looked at how the West was depicted in Russia, and it estimated from memory that 95% of the Russian people do not get any news from outside the Russian Federation. They get it, and television is hugely dominant in Russia, far more so than it is in the West, where we have many different channels, and access to the internet, as you just mentioned, Jane, is far wider. So there's, it's in with the poorer people and older people, he has this iron grip on on information that's disseminated to the vast majority of the Russian population. But that is obviously not enough for him. I think he is showing fear with this, and this is a draconian measure, and people have started saying, this will turn the Russian Federation into a North Korea. I think we could well see the British government and other governments around the world go on to brand, if this goes through, to actually brand Russia as a dictatorship.
OK, Cormac Smith, really interesting to talk to you. Thanks a lot for joining us on Sky News Breakfast. The Welsh Government's announced it will provide £4 million in financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine to help those in desperate need. Well, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, joins me now from Cardiff. And Mr Drakeford, it has been a hallmark of this conflict already, hasn't it? The enormous generosity of people and the willingness of people to give.
Absolutely. Some of our local authorities in Wales report almost being overwhelmed by the volume of goods, clothing, bedding, other forms of equipment that people have spontaneously wanted to donate to people who are experiencing such awful impacts in their own lives. But we know that cash is what is really needed here and now on the ground for people who can obtain those goods, put that money to best use, and that's why the £4 million from the Welsh Government will go to the Disasters and Emergency Committee appeal that we launched here in Wales yesterday.
And in terms of welcoming refugees into Wales, how many would you like to see coming to Wales, and what provisions could you have for them?
I think it's still really difficult to put numbers on these things when the position is so very volatile. What we want to see through the UK government is a simple, fast, safe and legal route for people needing to seek sanctuary elsewhere in the world and in Wales to be able to come here. Wales has an ambition to be a nation of sanctuary. We have welcomed people from Afghanistan and from Syria in recent times. I know there will be a real determination on the part of Welsh people to do everything we can to welcome people from Ukraine here when the time comes, and we want that to be as fast and as simple for them as can possibly be put in place.
What power does Wales have as a devolved nation to introduce different policies on refugees to the rest of the UK?
Well, we don't have the power to have different basic rules about how people enter the United Kingdom. But of course, once people arrive here, all the things that they will need, housing, healthcare, education for children and so on, all of those things are devolved, determined and decided upon here in Wales. And that's where we do very powerfully come into the picture, making sure that we align all the things that we can provide so that when people come here, they have both a warm welcome in coming to Wales, but also the practical help that they will need to re-establish their lives here. When I talked with UK government ministers yesterday, I urged them not to overplan things, to allow those of us who are closest to the ground to be able to make the decisions that will get those services to people who need them as quickly and as effectively as possible.
Now, obviously not to do down Wales, which is a place that I dearly love and have visited many, many times. But do you think many Ukrainians really will want to come all the way to Wales? The Refugee Council does say that 8 out of 10 refugees try to stay in the countries next to the one that they have left. I mean, in reality, it will probably be a very small number who will perhaps have the inclination to make the journey or choose to make it their home.
Well, we have hundreds of people from the Ukraine who live in Wales already. They will have family, they will have friends, they will, I know from speaking to them yesterday, want to bring people here to Wales, temporarily, as I'm sure they will hope, before the position allows them to return to the Ukraine. And yes, I completely recognise that the bulk of people will want to stay as close to the Ukraine as possible. But for those people, for whom Wales could be even a temporary home, a temporary place of sanctuary, we will want to do everything we can to welcome them and to provide for them.
OK, Mark Drakeford, First Minister of Wales, good to talk to you. Thanks a lot. Well, coming up on Sky News Breakfast, the Deputy Prime Minister, we spoke to him a little earlier, he tells me that the attack on the nuclear power plant on Ukraine is doubly reprehensible. We'll get more reaction after the break.